Welcome to this event on the 25th anniversary of the GCSP, an event on a new normal for the planet. Interestingly, it's also the 5th anniversary of the GCSP work focused on the issue of environment and security when we launched our first course on climate change and security. Much has happened since then. 2020 is a very special year, not only because of the public health challenge, but also for the common action, or rather insufficient action, on the environment. The question we are asking ourselves is the following. Would COVID-19 have offered a silver lining for the planet? Will the halt of the system to let the planet take a breath of clear air increase the resolve of policymakers to act on environmental challenges? Or on the contrary, will the focus on the current crisis prevent us from addressing the long-term challenge of climate change and other environmental threats? In other words, what are the opportunities and challenges of the current situation to the collective action on the environment, climate change, biodiversity, and their impact on peace and security? To speak about this, we have reached out to world-class experts on the topic that I will introduce briefly now. First, Mr. Alexander Verbeek will talk about the global perspective. Mr. Verbeek is a Dutch environmentalist, public speaker, moderator, and diplomat, and former strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is the founder of the Institute for Planetary Security and GCSP Associate Fellow. Second, we will hear about the European perspective from Dr. Jamie Shee, who's Professor of Strategy and Security of the Strategy and Security Institute, University of Exeter, and former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges and GCSP Associate Fellow. The African perspective will be covered by Mr. Mukhtar Ogle, Secretary at the Strategic Initiatives Department of the Cabinet Affairs Office in Executive Office of the President of Kenya. And last but not least, joining us from India, Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram, Assistant Professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations of the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. She will present the perspective from Asia. After speakers' presentations, we will open the floor for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab. Alexander Verbeek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to present to you. You will all know that there are some pivotal years in world history, and a relatively recent one is, for instance, in 1989. When so much happened, you probably think, when you hear 1989, of the pictures of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when I say 2001, you will probably think of 9/11 and the pictures of the collapse of the Twin Towers. Both pictures symbolize much more than, just what happened locally in Berlin or in New York City. The fall of the wall was the end of communism and was already foreshadowing the collapse of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. And for some, it even symbolized the end of history, until the end of history ended as well. And that was probably in 2001 when we entered a completely new phase with the fight against terrorism. So the pictures of the Twin Towers is much more than just Lower Manhattan. It leads you immediately to Afghanistan and Iraq and further. So that brings me to this year, this strange year of 2020. Someday in the future, a historian will write about this special year. Unlike 1989 or 2001, I found it much more difficult to find the picture. It's not, we don't have a Berlin Wall falling on one specific day, or we don't have a 9/11 date. So what I personally believe is still the best depiction of 2020 is this brilliant cartoon made by Brian Stauffer that was published on the cover of the New Yorker. Let me see if I can find that for you. Here it is. And I believe this cartoon summarizes perhaps best the feelings that many of us have about this year. And like the fall of the wall and the Twin Towers, this picture represents so much more than just the pandemic or just Donald Trump. Although those are the first two things that you will see when you see the cartoon. And for me, the mask stands for the Anthropocenic threats and the actions that we should take to mitigate or to adapt. And Trump stands for a lack of effective policies by the leaders of the world. It's much more than just him or his country. Ignoring the threats, being blind to the measures that are being advised by scientists. So let's look at the mask first, representing climate change and so on, before we go on to policies represented by Trump. So where are we in 2020? Well, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, and that's why we're meeting online here, is the pandemic. And like hurricanes and in a changing climate, there will be people that correctly say that we've always had hurricanes, but then you get the climate experts that will say, yes, that is true, but they're becoming more forceful and taking place in a wider area than where you would traditionally find them. And quite likely their frequency will go up as well. Actually, for this specific year, we're already out of letters of the alphabet and we had to start counting again. So that's a clear indication that frequency will go up as well. So in this context, it's relevant to note that the risk of pandemics, it's a bit the same story. We've always had pandemics, but the risk of pandemics is increasing by deforestation, by changing land use, by climate change, because you bring species together that would normally not meet, and that increases the risk of pandemics. Also staying with, the mask, the kind of threats, is that we live in the age of extinction. This is, in fact, the start of the sixth big extinction in the world, seventh, if you would count correctly, but everybody calls it the sixth. There's now 1 million species that are threatened with extinction, which is out of the about 8 million that we have. And in my lifetime, only in my lifetime, we've lost more than half of the animals on Earth. A shocking 96% of all mammals on Earth are either humans or livestock. So it's just 4% wildlife left. That is the planet that we're on now, and counting, I'm afraid. So, but 2020 is also the year of climate extremes, especially the situation in the Arctic should alarm any world leader. Just last month of October, the total Arctic sea ice volume is 60% below the average of the past 40 years. And it was already melting in the past 40 years. Just think about that for a moment. Losing 60% of the ice in the Arctic, the sea ice, not Greenland. Or think about the forest fires in Australia. Everybody can remember the pictures of the koalas. Forest fires in California. You see them in Colorado now as well. And think of the pictures of the flooding and the droughts everywhere else in the world. You probably don't think about those immediately when you think about climate change, just because the Western countries get so much more attention in the media. The village like Paradise burning in California gets much more attention than massive floodings in countries that are a bit farther away from the West. So in the future, historians will refer to these events when they state that 2020 or in the years around 2020, the world got increasingly worrying signs that business as usual is just no longer an option. So after decades of warnings by scientists, by 2020, these historians will write the impact of our abuse of nature was no longer a kind of slow moving or a local process or something far away. In a relatively short time, the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss appeared just more sudden and much more severe, and also much more globally instead of just a local manifestation. And that last aspect is important, because globalization used to be described as the success of the neoliberal economic model. But now the global impact of the human interference in nature is just much more globalized than the economic connections have ever achieved. So the real globalization is the destruction of our environment. And in this time of global upheaval, where everything has changed for all of us, I think it's safe to say that 2020 is the year that the wake-up calls of nature can no longer be ignored by the world leaders. And that brings me to, from the mask of the cartoon to the guy wearing it. This, yeah, well, that Mad Hatter is something special, but he is representing for me, in a way, political leaders that you find in quite a few places all over the world. I assume that our future historian that will describe the year 2020 will put this all in context, and we'll start in 2015. 2015 is, in the last months of 2015, we had a handful of top conferences all over the world, which gave a lot of hope. The most famous one is probably the Paris Agreement, about really setting limits to the amount of climate change that is acceptable for us, and the actions that we should take to stop it. And there, another one that you'll remember is New York, the acceptance of the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, or global goals, as we call them nowadays. But very soon after these hopeful months in late 2015, and partly in parallel, there was a kind of global populist political wind blowing in many countries across the world. And there was a movement that, and it's still out there, that favored short-term solutions and ignored the findings of science, and that believes that the stock market is the best indicator of your success, and that also leads to seeing the environment as something that you can just plunder and use for yourself, and that you don't have to think about the next generations. There was positive news too in these years. The EU, for instance, really strengthened its ambition in reducing greenhouse gases. Some will say it's not enough. I agree it's not enough, but I really see it as a very positive movement taking place. And then you have, of course, always those countries like Costa Rica or New Zealand really showing us what we should actually do. But those are not the countries that have the weight and the leverage of the really big countries in the world. You see that everywhere in the world in these past few years, and that's what the historian will describe of this time, people got more and more concerned about what is happening to our environment, and especially about climate change, and especially the youth that did find itself in a very unusual situation of having to educate their parents' generation about their responsibilities towards the future of their children, towards themselves, which is a bit the other way around, as you know, anything that we've been doing since the 1960s as young people is basically telling our parents that everything should be completely different, but not that they should, you know, take their responsibilities different. And then just before the end of this strange year of 2020, the country that's likely still the most important country in the world suddenly chose a new president that favors a dramatic change from the destructive policies of his predecessor. And for me, that is a moment that really gives hope that at the end of this annus horribilis for the planet, we will see some positive change. And perhaps some other countries that tried this path of populism might be inspired to also take up their long-term responsibilities. So is the present chaos on our planet with dying oceans and burning forests and this state of climate change, escalating refugee crisis, the rapid biodiversity loss, is that the new normal? Well, I wish it was. I really wish it was. But let's briefly go back to that historian. At the end of this century, when he writes a book about 2020, that book will describe how pleasant our summers still were, that people would go on holiday and they would dive in the ocean and see beautiful corals where you could swim in. And we still had the coastlines of the Holocene. They were basically kind of unchanged. And we still had more or less enough water and food on the planet for most people. And although some people, the most, let's say, the better educated people certainly recognized climate change as a thing that's there and that we should take very serious, there were not many people that were really afraid of a kind of hothouse Earth scenario that was seen by hothouse Earth was seen as science fiction or alarmist. So this historian will be particularly fascinated by the way that we dealt with this crisis. We had people that focused on climate change, and other people focused on the pandemic. And then you have people that really focused on the food crisis or the water crisis, and the security community was waking up to the climate crisis and getting involved in dealing with climate change and security. Already in 2014, a few relatively small group was talking about planetary security that focused on all these different crises in a holistic way, not climate insecurity, but all the planetary change and how that is impacting security, and also how all these threats that I just summed up and more of them, how are reinforcing each other in a negative way. So you have these compounded risks that should be taken care of. And I believe that is a trend that will continue. And more the different strains of policy making will increasingly view these challenges through the lens of climate change and the loss of nature and the loss of access to resources. So experts from different fields will start to cooperate better to see these connections. And although cooperation in challenging times is by far more likely than conflict, and also, of course, the more preferred option, security specialists will increasingly have to rely on the knowledge of these experts and also combine all this knowledge and learn to better cooperate with them. I believe a very promising sign that governments get this insight comes this week from America in the decision by the incoming Biden administration to name John Kerry as the first person that is fully dedicated to climate. He's called the Climate Tsar, but he will also serve in the National Security Council. And that really puts at the highest level of government, integrates climate and security. So new normal suggests a kind of newfound stability. It ignores the positive feedback loops and the tipping points, because once you pass a tipping point, you can't go back. If an animal, some kind of species has died out, it will never come back. However positive your future policies will be, we won't see the northern white rhino anymore once these last two females have died out. So there's often no way back. So I think new normal sounds much too reassuring. We're just at the beginning of seeing the impacts of climate change, and well, you ain't seen nothing yet. So if we continue on our path, and if we don't see enough indications that we will change in the course of time, we will destroy the living conditions on this planet in ways that are really hard to imagine, but they're well described by scientists. And therefore, instead of speaking of a new normal, I would say that in 2020, we're at the edge of tumbling into the Anthropocene's rabbit hole. Once there, we will end up in a world that is as disorienting as only Lewis Carroll could have imagined. It will be without his talking caterpillars. Actually, there won't be any caterpillars or butterflies left in that world. but it will feel like the alternate reality with unknown challenges. For instance, imagine life in the Anthropocene's rabbit's hole once most of the glaciers of the Himalayas have melted just by the end of this century. 2 billion people depend on the water of the glaciers in the Himalayas. Just imagine the consequences. First, there will be too much water because of melting, and then there won't be enough water. Who's going to deal with these consequences? How are we going to do that? So to end, I hope we won't tumble into the rabbit hole of the Anthropocene. We're still at the edge. We can change our course, and we know how to do it. We have the knowledge. We have the technology. We don't have to develop new technology. The only thing that we need is capable leadership, and there's jobs and opportunities to grab in a much greener world, which will, by the way, also be much more just and fair. And I see no reason at all to wait to change course and limit climate change, save nature, create a world where we carefully deal with the scarce resources that we have in a just way. So cooperate better. And in doing so, I believe we can create a so much better world. It is possible, and let's do it. And it's a challenge of not of technology, not of knowledge. It's a challenge of leadership and insight and convincing people that this is the way that we should deal with our planet and stay on a more positive course. So let's end with this positive note. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Alexander, and thank you so much for ending on a more positive note, because listening to you, I was going into this rabbit hole more and more. So thank you so much for giving this hope. Jamie, the floor is yours.
I do apologise, Anna. I seem to be in the habit of pushing the wrong button today. Good job I was not in charge of NATO's nuclear strategy when I worked there for so many years. We may not be here today. Had I been. No, joking aside, it's an absolute pleasure to be back at the GCSP today, if only virtually. I well remember the 20th anniversary of the GCSP, which was in much happier times. It was summer. You hired a lovely boat and took us out on Lake Geneva for the evening with an Papa band and lots of beer. It was a very joyous occasion. But obviously, and Alexander's pointed to this, we live in much darker times these days. And our topic this week is a much darker one too. So, but hopefully with Alexander's final note of optimism, when we celebrate the 30th anniversary, we could do the boat again and re-invite that wonderful Papa band. Alexander, I think, inevitably sketched very well the sort of global picture, and you've asked me to talk about this from the European angle. I think the first thing to say is that Europe has always aspired to be the global leader on climate change and climate change diplomacy. And inevitably, Anna, when we talk about Europe, we have to talk about the EU because who else really could claim to speak for Europe? And of course, it's very much at the level of the Brussels EU institutions that much of the effort, the diplomatic effort, the technological effort, the heavy lifting is concentrated. And the first starting point is that this year, or last year, coming in, the new Commission under Ursula von der Leyen has put climate change and the digital economy, she calls the climate change the European Union Green Deal, at the very, very top of the agenda. And with the idea, which is very ambitious, that over the next sort of 20 or 30 years to come, virtually every aspect of EU policy, whether it be trade, whether it be industrial policy, whether it be transport, whether it be energy, whether it be agriculture, is going to be green. The climate change, the carbon reduction goals are going to be fed into every strand of this policy. And just in preparation for today, I was looking up, what sort of instruments the EU has put on the table to try to achieve this. And at least in terms of the level of ambition, it's impressive. The idea is a European Green Deal investment plan, a just transition mechanism, a climate law, a European climate pact, a European industrial strategy, a circular economy action plan. You're familiar with the term circular economy in the EU. It means that at the end of the day, everything is recycled, nothing is wasted, and so the economy is able to circulate without a new production, wasteful production needing to be constantly fed in. There's a farm to fork strategy to have a better sort of a sustainability in agriculture, and an EU biodiversity strategy. So this adds up to quite a lot. Now, I think, in terms of trying to be a leader, the EU, first of all, recognizes that if it cannot, lead at home, if it can't be a good model internally, its clout, its leverage, its, if you like, public diplomacy power vis-a-vis the rest of the world will be limited. You have to practice what you preach. And it's obvious that, and Alexander was referring to the Trump administration, if the US went around, preaching to everybody else the virtues of democracy or free or fair elections, the virtues of, an unpolluted social media and free internet discourse, the virtues of minority participation in politics and avoiding voter suppression. The US over the last couple of years did not particularly set a good example in relaying that message. We'll see, hopefully, as Alexander mentioned, if things now improve in that domain. But you have to get it right at home first and foremost. And as Alexander said, the EU has set some very big targets. A couple of years ago, it had the target of reducing its CO2 emissions by 40% up to 2030. This has now been increased to 55%. Business is not totally happy with this because obviously with the impact of COVID-19, there's some worries that, the funds to do this, the ability to change production quickly will be more limited. But the goal is there. And by 2050, the EU has got this target now of zero CO2 emissions. And having set this target, the EU tends often to set the standards that others then emulate. Others like China recently have come on board, and we'll see if Joe Biden is willing to adopt this target as well. So it's very important, of course, and Alexander mentioned this, that the action takes place among the 8 or 9 countries in the world, which are collectively responsible for 80% plus of all global emissions. And if one bloc like the EU moves, but representing about 18% of the global economy, but the other blocs don't, then the EU may make prodigious efforts, but it will still be running far behind the global increase in warming. So it's good that the EU sets an example, but if it doesn't leverage this in terms of convincing the rest of the world to follow, then by the end of the century, there was a Danish scientist who worked this out, that if the rest of the world did nothing while the EU achieved these goals, you won't believe this, but the Danish scientist came up with some very convincing evidence. The EU would postpone global warming by 2 weeks. 2 weeks only by the end of this century. So it does show that convening power of the EU is key. The EU has a good record in this respect because you are all familiar with the GDPR, the Global Directive on Data Protection, which has not yet become the universal standard, but more and more countries and even the state of California have now signed up to this as the benchmark for data privacy standards. The EU has sponsored COVAX now. It's convened the big conferences to gather 36 billion euros to be able to ensure that the developing countries which have the least possibility of accessing the vaccines, I found depressingly today that 96% of the vaccines which will come on the market in 2021 have already been earmarked by the big industrial countries under private deals, leaving only 4% for the rest of the world, which may have to wait until 2024 to access the vaccine. So something like COVAX, which is only spending, by the way, 1/10 of what the world economy is losing every month as a result of the pandemic, again shows the EU being able to act as the convener. So it will be tested in this area as well. But as I mentioned, the EU has got to get it right at home first and foremost. It's got ambitious plans, for example, climate proofing of homes and businesses, obviously creating a reliable 24/7 grid based on renewables, whether it be solar power, often lacking in Europe in the winter, particularly here in Brussels, but more abundant in the south, but certainly wind power, where there is a much greater abundance in Europe. So a solar renewable grid, obviously moving to electric cars, introducing a much better insurance market for climate risk and assessment, and building resilience across the European economy against climate change scenarios. All this sounds good, but of course we all know that politics gets in the way globally and in the EU as well. There are strains and stresses. The first thing, of course, is internationally. If the European Union places a carbon tax on imports into the European Union from other countries, where they will pay tariffs for coming in with so-called dirty products, this could create tensions, of course, with the United States, with other countries across the Atlantic, as the EU tries to enhance its free trade agreements. It could even be a problem with my country, the UK, if we don't get a decent trade deal in the wake of Brexit. That's the first thing. Secondly, if the European Union tries to come up with an emission standard, again, taxing companies that are not able to effectively come up with certificates for the right to emit, and what the level of taxation should be there, particularly at a time when the EU, still in an age of globalization, needs to attract a considerable degree of inward foreign investment. A second problem concerns the gap between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. You see in Western Europe a sort of politics that we get it. In Germany, for example, the Green Party is now the official opposition with 20% of the vote, way ahead of the Social Democrats on 11 to 12%, and ahead even of the populist Alternative für Deutschland. The Greens are in the government in 11 out of 16 of the German Länder. The constituent states. It's no accident that Greta Thunberg, of course, came from a European country, Sweden. And we've seen, the Friday for the Future movement across Europe, particularly in Germany. Alexander, of course, referred to Extinction Rebellion. These groups have spread elsewhere, but are essentially European. There has been a very much grassroots support in favor of climate action. It's not only a top-down phenomenon, but the latest Eurobarometer poll shows that whereas in Sweden, 48% of the population believe that climate change is the most urgent priority, if you go to Poland or Bulgaria and ask the same question, it goes back down to 10%. And one of the big tensions, of course, that we know in the European Union as it tries to move forward is that Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, which still burn large amounts of brown coal and lignite from the old communist days, are very reluctant to accept the kind of limits, or want extra money for their conversion, or simply believe that the EU has no business in dictating to them how fast they make the green transition. Only 11 of the 27 European countries at the moment, according to the European Climate Change Performance Index, because fortunately the EU has lots of statistics to measure these things, are judged to be high performers. So there are still, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, a large number of laggards. The second big issue is that the EU now has pending just been approved by the European Parliament, an enormous 1.8 trillion euro package for the next financial framework, of which 750 billion euros will be dedicated, as you know, to the European Recovery Programme, 2/3 of which will be grants for the first time. Yep, the Germans agreed, rather than low interest loans, to help with transition. But you can imagine that there are a number of countries in the East and Southern Europe who are happy to get this money, no strings attached, to pay off their budget deficits or to pay extra money to their healthcare workers, which is natural, the frontline workers in dealing with the crisis. But if after a few years it's clear that all of this money has sort of disappeared and nobody knows where, with little effect, and has not been used for the kind of innovative technologies, the green technologies, the conversion to the carbon zero economy, the appetite of Germany, let alone the Netherlands, Alexander's home country, or Denmark, or some of the other sort of fiscal conservatives, the Finns, the appetite of the North to sort of go through these bailout programs again will have disappeared without sight altogether. So the EU's got these enormous ambitions at home to be able to lead the world, but of course the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. So now we turn to the sort of external part. Well, the EU talks a lot about the Green Deal diplomacy. This term is now circulating in Brussels, and it's the idea that Europeans are going to take their sort of model leading role at home and translate this, as I said, into leverage abroad. Of course, the EU has liked the idea over the last couple of years of the Trump administration. It hasn't liked the Trump administration, but it's liked the idea that the EU now stands for the paragon of, rescuing the multilateral system, the rules-based international order, at a time when this is being disputed by the revisionist powers, including the United States, but of course China and Russia most notably as well. Now it has a US partner to work with, particularly in the expectation that Biden will come back into the Paris Peace Agreement. So the first challenge is to work with the United States in proposing an ambitious agenda for further reductions at the COP26, which is postponed by 1 year, but which will be hosted by the UK in Glasgow next November. Now, the UK leads the G7 next year, and Italy leads the G20. And at any one time, the EU will, I can't include the UK anymore because of Brexit, but in the old days, at any one time, the EU would have 5 of the 15 members of the Security Council at any one time. Well, Switzerland is coming on next year, so is Norway. So it doesn't always apply, but at least Europeans are heavily represented on the Security Council. So this gives in 2021, the Europeans, the EU, providing it can work with the UK, of course, and Norway and Switzerland, a great deal of heft in moving this agenda forward. The EU in Paris agreed to the most ambitious reduction targets. These are still voluntary, of course, and so can it work with the United States, looking to Glasgow to come up with an additional package? Second issue, the COPs have not featured a great deal of debate on the security aspects, and I'll turn to these in just a moment. Over the last couple of years, it's been mainly about mitigation, the idea of getting below 2% to 1.5 warming over pre-industrial levels. But the special report of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is really the scientific expertise in this area, has increasingly been putting adaptation, in other words, what do we do with the warming that we cannot stop any longer, and which is going to produce all of those nasty phenomena like floods and bushfires, and this year, for example, 27 named hurricanes so far this year, the largest number in history, which then, of course, are going to cause all of the devastation we know. So can it build more ambitious reduction targets, working with the US and others? And can it also put onto the agenda how we should be dealing with the security aspects, which have gained some traction in the EU. There was a council meeting on this last October, and also with not enough, but at least some meetings since 2007 of the UN Security Council on this issue. That partnership, I think, is going to be very important. The second thing, very briefly, is the differentiation between the G20, where most of the polluters contributors are, and the developing countries, and produced two particular tracks for that. And can it put climate change, the EU, into its overall sort of foreign policy goals, particularly, for example, its distribution of aid to Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America? Can it align its energy policy with its climate policy? One big contradiction I think we've found in the EU is that energy policy tends to be about security of supply. For example, building Nord Stream to bring more Russian natural gas into Europe, to develop terminals for liquefied natural gas in Poland, in Lithuania. A new one is opening up in Croatia, another one is planned for Greece, to bring in from Qatar, from the United States gas, etc. But of course, this will continue to make the European economy dependent upon fossil fuels. It may be less polluting gas than oil, which is a good sign, but it's still something that can hold up the transition. I mean, there are always these difficult trade-offs in climate policy between different aspects of a policy. For example, the Germans took themselves out of nuclear power. Good. But at the price of increasing their imports of Russian natural gas and burning more coal. So how can the EU use its various mechanisms to sort of, not just make climate change an empty shell contradicted by all of the individual policies, but to put these policies in a coordinated manner? Now, finally, for the security aspects, well, firstly, the EU is looking at two particular regions of strategic interest. Number one, the High North. No need to talk about that in detail because the listeners will be familiar with that, but the melting of the ice pack and the notion of whether that is going to open up a sort of new El Dorado for oil and natural gas exploration, particularly as about 25% of the world's oil and natural gas are under the polar ice pack, or were, and now become potentially open to exploration. And we've seen Russia and China trying to open up the North-East Passage route. It has now, in the summer, opened up for navigation, and what the implications of geopolitical competition are going to be. However, the irony is that at the moment when climate opens this region up to more trade and potential geopolitical competition and rivalries, and military activities are increasing in this area quite dramatically, particularly as Russia projects its power throughout the region, even flying very close to American airspace in Alaska now and causing some incidents, particularly with fisheries. But at the same time, the COVID-induced recession has plummeted gas and oil prices, making it unattractive commercially to begin that exploration. So the northern area, which has received a lot of attention, is not developing in quite the same urgent way that maybe it could. On the other hand, the EU is really crucially aware of the impact of climate change on Africa, where in sub-Saharan Africa, warming is taking place at twice the average, and conditions in the Sahel, in areas like Chad, in terms of food production, water supplies, migration, all of these things are happening very, very quickly. And countries in the EU, particularly France, which has deployed a large number of troops to Mali, the Central African Republic, has tried to get the UN more involved. Other EU countries has tried to get more regional cooperation, the G5 Sahel. France worries very much about the nexus between climate change, soil erosion, water scarcity, extremism, ethnic conflicts, the struggles that we've seen in Sudan between sedentaries and nomads and all of that. Climate change is not necessarily the driving force. The political tensions were there already, but it's a considerable force multiplier. And there are worries, of course, migration is not quite the immense challenge for Europe that it was in 2011, but there's also a view that what we're experiencing at the moment because of COVID is more a respite, and large numbers of migrants will continue to come our way. And of course, there is a nexus between conflict and terrorism. 90% of all terrorist activities take place in countries already riven by conflicts. And so this big issue about, well, can you solve the climate change before you work on the diplomacy diplomacy and the conflict resolution. How do you get migrants to stay at home? What kind of assistance there's going to be? The EU is planning a big summit early in the new year with the African countries, and Africa is very much on the agenda. Before I stop, let me mention a few other things, because you also, Anna, I know, wanted me very briefly to get into some of the security implications. Well, there is a notion, of course, that the security community, which was rather reluctant to get into this debate, because it didn't want to sort of convey the impression that we should give up attempts to reduce CO2 emissions and now, plan for a nightmarish world of climate adaptation. But there is a view that, as I've said, some of those challenges are now inevitable and the military have to step up. And basically, the idea is to do practical things that help. For example, last week, the European Space Agency sent up a Sentinel-6B satellite with NASA. So, transatlantic cooperation in action, which is part of the Galileo program and which can monitor rising sea levels globally. So one thing that the security policy community can do is obviously the mapping, the assessment, the big data, the predictive models, which could create a kind of early warning crisis watch system. We can't predict that this bushfire is going to break out tomorrow there, but we can have a notion of where things are at that tipping point that Alexander rightly referred to, an early warning mechanism. Secondly, geoengineering. If we start going towards some of these more nightmarish scenarios because we completely, miss our final opportunity to keep global warming under 2%, and we don't have many more years to do that, then, certain countries are going to start playing around with very dangerous things like solar flares, sun blocking mechanisms, river diversification. China has started trying to do some of that already. It could go disastrously wrong, and there is an urgent need for the security policy community to define a set of norms and rules of transparency before certain powers, take the climate into their own hands and mess it up for all of us with risky geoengineering projects. I think there's a need to redesign aid policy because, the military are often sent in to deal with disasters that could have been prevented had aid been distributed before the storm to build resilience and to evacuate people, etc., rather than after the storm when all of the damage is done. But the aid aspect is not geared with the security aspect, and they need to be aligned. There's this notion that when you go off on training missions or capacity building missions, you try to help countries understand their climate vulnerabilities, populations, food supplies, infrastructure, distribution networks, pre-storage, and you help countries as part of these missions to recognize their vulnerabilities and build in that kind of resistance as well. The way in which we see our militaries, and a final comment, getting more and more involved in homeland security tasks. Look at COVID, with military building hospitals or carrying out test and tracing, even burying the dead in Italy, shows that the military are now learning better, not just to fight wars, but to interact, with the police, with the NGOs, with the humanitarian relief organizations. They're looking at resilience, they're looking at hardening infrastructure, they're developing more expertise here. And although, that may be for COVID-19, the same principles obviously apply when it comes to the scenarios coming from climate change as well. And as Alexander and I know, there are several now very good groups of retired military personnel that are setting up, of people who are really now active in this debate, lobbying governments with good reports and to build their expertise. And as we discussed, final word right at the beginning before we started, even NATO now is getting into the game somewhat belatedly, with the Secretary General giving a speech on how NATO can also help with these sort of climate change, rapid response adaptation scenarios, working with partners, helping to build that kind of resilience, working on assistance to allies and partners in emergency situations. And just like the EU, EU has its rapid response forces and its battle groups and its partnerships. The two organizations can work increasingly together to share their expertise in this area. And final word, I would hope that climate change would then become part of one of NATO's emerging security challenges, along with cyber and space, when it develops, I think, next year, its new strategic concept. So let me stop there. And again, thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for this excellent speech. I will now give the floor to Mukhtar Ogle, who's based in Kenya. Mukhtar, if you could unmute yourself and go back on the camera.
Well, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. Also on the auspices of the 25th anniversary. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. My name is Mukhtar Ogle, Secretary for Strategic Initiatives. The work I mainly do in the Office of the President is in community peace building and resilience. And as you have rightly put it, looking at the challenges of security, or essentially the nexus between security, land, and environment, has been a critical pillar to the work that I do in building in community peace building and resilience. Over the years, from 2014, the work that I do was mainly on countering violent extremism and also preventing young people from becoming radicalized and joining global jihadist network. So you may ask, what has this got to do with climate change and climate mitigation, and particularly for that matter for issues of climate action? In this regard, I would like to take this opportunity to explain some of the work that we do, while acknowledging the appropriate theme of this engagement on a new planet for the new normal, a new normal for the planet, a new normal for the planet in the context of COVID-19. As I said, climate change mitigation has become one of the crucial areas of engagement for us with communities by examining the place of development, land, and security, and how it relates to issues of climate change. The bulk of the work we do through community networks is to initiate and coordinate efforts on environmental challenges and opportunities for better targeted mitigation, especially like issues of floods, drought, and the chronic cycle of community displacement, either induced by conflicts that has its roots in the challenges of climate change, or fights and conflicts over pasture, water, and multiple other issues. We also attempt to reverse the generational scars of conflict through leadership training amongst the communities, mentoring, and also try to providing strategic guidance on effective, quality, and timely government support for struggling communities, particularly in relation to issues of environmental conservation, wildlife management. I think what is true for Kenya is true for other African countries. I don't pretend to be speaking for Africa, but I think we make an initial analysis and make some comparison, looking at the issues of wildlife management through resilient communities and ownership roles. In this regard, I would like also to share what we have so far done in these issues and what actually pushed us to climate action and climate change mitigation. As you are aware, in our country, the president is the global champion for the Global Youth Champion, where we have initiated several programs with partners such as UNDP, UNICEF, World Bank, private sector players, international and local and non-local state actors. In this regard, we have sought to establish high-level government, steering committee that coordinates these activities, which led to the eventual launch of the Generation Unlimited. Looking at the place of the next generation of young people, especially youth and emerging women leaders, in securing our planet, will also necessitate the necessary recourse for climate justice and mentor young people onto this new role. So examining the impact of post-COVID, regeneration, post-COVID, engagement for the new normal. We have to engage and breathe a fresh life to this and attitude to these young people. I also want to acknowledge the role that we have played, particularly in hosting the UN Secretary General in 2019. This, though it was about a conference about confronting violent extremism, the central theme of our engagement has been on issues of climate change, especially the one that ravages African countries, which relates in displacements, loss of dignified livelihoods, displacement on communities, and essentially feeding into insecurity for many of these communities. We have a very elaborate program with the United Nations Development Program, which is referred to as which we help in launching the Accelerator Lab, which looks at the national and the cross-county, which provides strategic linkages with government entities to scale and also support peace-building processes by silencing the guns amongst radicalized groups, and also but among communities that have acquired small firearms and engage in conflict. And essentially, you will see that the most vicious conflicts in communities are communities that have become victims of climate change, either droughts, floods, the stress that is induced through these communities, scales also into a very serious security issue. Underlying the challenges of climate change also is the issue of mental health, which we also attempt to look at, to be at peace with planet nature, to look at issues of trauma healing and community reconciliation for peace. It's only when we are at peace with ourselves and at peace with nature, we can meaningfully talk about securing peace, community coexistence, and climate justice. I think climate justice also is rooted in the community's desires for social justice. And this for us, and I think for Africa, is very important. Many of the programs that we are engaged in silencing the guns, an initiative supported by the African Union in collaboration with the European Union and the United Nations, looks at how youth actors engage in cattle rustling, also how to have rehabilitate organized gangs in the urban centers, especially from the informal sector, and also mentor them through leadership, and also to bring to life the challenges of climate change for the next generation. And looking at the opportunities, and I think part of our post-COVID strategies of recovery is looking at what are the opportunities for us to have a peaceful country and peaceful community, and also amongst the cross-border communities in Somalia, Ethiopia, Southern Sudan, Uganda, which have repeated cases of political insurgency and a regular cross-border dialogue, which helps to live with each other peacefully. Then this takes me also to another issue of governance, on the issue of electoral justice, I think in the Africa region, where there are conflicts that are due to elections, which communities are also displaced, and there's conflict, and in the process, there's serious displacement and communities migrating. This has been also another area of concern for us. So it also helps us engaging in leadership and community orientation towards accountable and constructive citizenship. I think with those few remarks, I want to thank all of you, and I look forward to further engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mukhtar Ogle, for your excellent input, and I think that we are going to have many questions for you in the Q&A session. And now we are moving all the way to Asia, to India, in more particular, to listen to Dhanasree, Jayaram, and her remarks.
Thank you, Anna. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this event, which is to commemorate the 25th anniversary of GCSP. So congratulations to everyone, first of all. Coming to the topic of this particular session in itself, it's quite a daunting task to talk about something as broad as environment and security, which interact with each other at multiple levels, as the previous three speakers spoke about. And that is why it becomes much more difficult to be imaginative and think about futures in such a way that we can have policies that would actually be beneficial to everyone. So here I am going to talk about mostly from an Asian perspective, although Asia in itself is a huge continent and covers so many different regions with different priorities and interests. So I would speak about mostly India, South Asia, the Himalayan region, and some other parts of the neighboring regions where I can cover those interlinkages between environment and security and how they really play out. So I will start sharing my presentation. Okay. I'm not able to find it. Yes, found it. All right. Yes. Okay. So as the topic says, a new normal for the planet, how will environment and security interact in the future? And I guess to talk about this topic, you also have to know what happened in the past and what's going on currently to understand the future implications of environmental change, as we are seeing with the way in which climate change is happening, or how biodiversity is being affected. Desertification is happening in many places. You have disasters whose impacts are also worsening year by year. So maybe, I just thought I'll start with this slide, which shows pictures of the calamities or catastrophes that we have seen this year alone in India, which is again a huge country, facing multiple crises at the same time. So as you can see, I put it as a perfect storm, which was also used in the past in the context of the water, energy, food nexus approach with population increase and all of that. But I just thought this would be a perfect example to show what has been the problems that India alone in the huge Asian continent has been facing just this year. So starting with the COVID-19 crisis, of course, the pandemic has unleashed a whole lot of problems for the government, for the people. You have the locust attack, which affected parts of Eastern Africa, West Asia, and also Southern Asia. So this problem came up especially during the summer months, and parts of North India especially were heavily affected. Even Pakistan was affected by the locust attacks, which in fact affected the food production in parts of these countries. And although thankfully we had a bumper crop this year, so it didn't really affect much. But then in the end, these are the kind of problems we are foreseeing in the future, and we need to be prepared for. Then you have extreme heat conditions, which has become a perennial problem for this part of the world, where temperatures are soaring every summer. We are breaking records. So this is another major problem which affects the economy, which affects health, which affects almost all sectors of the country's the growth, the so-called development agenda that the countries in this region have actually come up with. All these developmental gains can be eroded by the environmental change that we are witnessing. Now, this has become a new norm. In fact, the kind of cyclones, the tropical cyclones that we are seeing in the Bay of Bengal region, for that matter, even today, we are looking at a cyclone that is hitting the eastern coast of India, and 3 states are in emergency situation. And this has been a major problem this whole year. We've had the strongest cyclone, Cyclone Amphan, then we had Cyclone Nisarga, which hit the western parts of India. Bangladesh was severely affected by Amphan. It has still not completely recovered from the disastrous effects of the cyclone itself. So cyclones or tropical cyclones are another menace that we have faced this year. So 2020 being this year, which has actually posed a lot of challenges to India. Okay, so another problem that we have seen is erratic rainfall. So yes, extreme weather events, extreme precipitation events are leading to agricultural crisis. So the agrarian crisis in this part of the world, again, is quite acute. And when you have climate change adding to the existing gamut of challenges, the food prices are going up. So that, as you can see, this picture is that of onion, which is like a staple vegetable of so many dishes across this region again. Now, this is something that doesn't affect just India. It affects even the neighboring countries which are known for importing onions from India. So the food price hike or food inflation, that is not something that just affected India, but all the countries in the region because of the ban, especially that was imposed by India on onion exports. And countries like Bangladesh, for instance, are extremely dependent on the onion imports from India. So that's yet another problem that we have seen. And then this picture shows, I guess, one of the biggest human catastrophes that this country has witnessed in a long period of time. These are the people, the migrant laborers who had to move from various cities of the country to their respective hometowns. And this was all during the lockdown, the strictest lockdown that this country faced in March and April months. And it actually pricked the consciousness of the entire country, because even today the governments do not have numbers on how many people actually had to move from cities to their hometowns during this crisis period. So that was yet another problem. And I guess even today it has not been completely resolved because so many people are out of jobs and livelihoods and everything. And then you have floods. So the problem of floods is not, again, new to India or, again, like I said, South Asia at large. But in fact, even other countries like China, for instance, the seasonal flooding which you see in those countries has become never-ending saga. So, you would see the flooding season come and go. But now China, for instance, has experienced numerous floods this year. Same thing with some parts of India in the northeastern parts where a state like Assam is affected by floods 5 times a year. And if such incidents recur, obviously the economy is affected. Also, the people do not have anywhere to move in the end. So the displacement and migration problem, in fact, is also becoming chronic in many parts of the country. So these are the environmental kind of disasters that you're seeing everywhere. And then you have this picture here, which shows the India-China border dispute, which is another major security situation that this region is facing with Indian and Chinese soldiers on both sides of the border engaging in a conflict, although it's not a full-fledged war, but situation is still not completely diffused. And yeah, the why I have put this is also important because it kind of brings to fore the idea of security itself, as to where we are in terms of how do we understand security, if this is security, or is this security, which is security, or are all these matters security and how much they are interrelated. And the reason why the India-China dispute also, in fact, comes, I would say, has very relevant interconnections with environmental change is what is in the next slide here, basically showing the Hindu-Kush Himalaya region, which is one of the most environmentally fragile regions in the world. And it is also one of the most heavily militarized regions in the world as well. So now you see the problem with, I saw one question being raised in the comments as well about the realism, right? And state taking over security concerns, and how are these security concerns really framed in various discourses do really matter as to how policies and strategies are also made. Now, this region, in fact, spans 8 countries from Afghanistan to Myanmar. And in fact, you can see how many countries are dependent on the rivers that flow from the Hindu-Kush Himalaya region. And you can see that, you have 4 global biodiversity hotspots, you have diverse cultures and languages and religions, 10 major Asian river systems, largest reserves of ice outside the polar regions, which is why it is also called the third pole of the world, in fact. But if you look at the human security issues that are there, apart from the national security issues that are usually discussed under the garb of the India-China dispute and everything, you can see about how many people, 240 million people who directly depend on this region for their lives and livelihoods. You have 1.9 billion people who depend on this region for water, food, and energy. And I think even Alexander was mentioning about the Himalayan region being so critical for such a huge region. So as you can imagine, so you have contested borders here which are, of course, geopolitically very volatile between India and Pakistan, between India and China, for that matter, now even between India and Nepal. So you have all these contested boundaries issue, which are yet to be resolved. But if you look at the whole region from a very deterritorialized perspective, you would know how much interconnected these countries are in the end, and why there is a crucial need for regional leadership to deal with issues of environmental security and human security. And as you can see here, it clearly shows how the disasters, including because of the land use change and habitat destruction, landslides, and a whole lot of other problems, how the disasters have gone up, the number of disasters have gone up, and the losses due to losses of life and economic losses have gone up in the past few years. And poverty still continues to be very high as compared to some of the other regions of this particular continent. But we had some slight ray of hope. In fact, on 15th October, despite the geopolitical conflicts, you had the environment ministers of all the countries, in fact, meeting through this virtual summit, where a number of things were agreed upon. In fact, which gives us some ray of hope in terms of speaking in a united voice. For instance, talking about livelihoods, food and nutritional security, gender, children, climate change, deforestation, talking about SDGs and whether science can build bridges between countries. Also, the fact that this region, if you look at this region, there is still not enough data or continuous kind of monitoring of the way climate is changing in this region. So in fact, for that itself, you need regional cooperation. It is not something that one country can technically do. And another problem with that is also about data sharing, which is often kind of linked to national security concerns. And then obviously some of these issues get scuttled in the process of this geopolitical conflict. So yeah, so that those are the, this is probably one meeting. There was another meeting in April also, in fact, where some of these issues clearly raised the importance of this region, where, as you can see, all these countries are stakeholders. But apart from some activities which are done by ICMOD, if you look at the state level kind of cooperation, there's not much happening, and which is the sad story of this era. Okay. This particular assessment, again, which was carried out very recently, this study was published earlier this year in 2020, in fact, which shows what is expected, what are the projections going to be like for this region in the future. So already it is very clear about the temperature rise, the changes in rainfall is quite evident. So the Indian summer monsoon, the southwest monsoon, in fact, has become a tipping point in this climate discourse. Sea level rise is also affecting a lot of these coastal areas of India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and all these other countries which have coasts, and of course the tropical cyclones, which I mentioned. So with these kind of studies, what we we need to understand is that this is a problem that is going to only become worse for the countries, and therefore there is a need to look into solutions, not just, individually or at the national level or the local level, but also at the regional level and beyond that through multilateral fora. So I'll come to some of the solutions. I thought of, as Anna said, maybe give some hope as well and what is happening right now at the ground level. So I must say that there is a lot happening. It's not like nothing is happening. Yes, there are geopolitical issues. There is a problem of leadership and political will and all of that. And there is a problem of course, not enough resources. But in the end, you would see that there is an upsurge in the kind of community participation that is happening. And I think what is important here to note is that we need to look at initiatives which are community owned and community driven. So I'm a strong believer of the bottom-up approaches, and I think that has worked in many parts of Asia. And there are many examples from South Asia, Southeast Asia especially, and this is something that needs to be strengthened even further. And this is where even traditional and local knowledge systems, for instance, have to play a much bigger role in how solutions are reached. And this is where, again, the traditional knowledge systems of women, of the elderly, of various other vulnerable sections of the population not just in terms of representation, but also how they are valued in most of the decision-making systems needs to be taken care of. And that is why conflict sensitivity, for instance, now you have also regions in region like West Asia, Afghanistan, the Rohingya crisis. You have so many countries which are conflict prone, and there are countries which have just come out of conflicts and are in the post-conflict peace building process. Now, climate change is definitely going to add to the challenges of this conflict, post-conflict peace building process. And therefore, some of these policies which countries are trying to implement needs to be conflict sensitive itself, so that adaptation projects, for instance, do not exacerbate the existing tensions between communities. And that becomes extremely important. And for that, the local knowledge systems have to be given priority to a large extent. In that way, there is also a lot of emphasis that we need to pay to mass mobilization, which is just gaining momentum in many parts of this region. So yes, there are a lot of priorities, and climate change doesn't come up very often in some of these discussions. But I think increasingly with the youth mobilization happening, you can see that there are a lot of movements which are gaining momentum as well. Action-oriented environmental education is yet another area which is being increasingly looked into. So, for instance, even India is coming out with a new education policy from next year onwards, and this is something. They just released it this year. And one of the focuses of this particular policy is, of course, to look at environmental education and look at solutions, action-oriented education, which can help the country achieve some of its targets, even in terms of climate change and other environmental targets. Now, why I put systems thinking here is, of course, to deal with, like the first slide that I showed, where so many issues are interconnected with each other. So I think increasingly we are realizing that security itself needs systems thinking, where we talk about the entire system, where one change can have ripple effects on other parts of the system as well. And I don't think I need to talk too much about the regional and sub-regional leadership, because again, Asia is a huge continent. You have so many regional organizations. You have GCC in West Asia, you have SAARC in South Asia, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, SCO, Central Asia, and also covering some parts of South Asia. And then you have BIMSTEC. So many different regional organizations are active, but the level of emphasis they're giving to issues of environment is quite low. Now that needs to change, and I think that is where the geopolitical will needs to be there in order for the countries to come together to resolve some of these problems. And that is where multilateralism also needs to kind of get ahead in terms of, we need to move away from the nationalistic and populist kind of ideas of what really national security is, to move towards more of multilateral thinking on cooperation. And the reasons why it is important, I think I kind of reflected on them in the previous slide, where I showed some of these issues cannot be resolved unless countries come together to talk about them. And there is also this important aspect of knowledge and data creation, because that is one area where I feel there is a serious dent here. So, for instance, we talk about how environmental change affects conflict dynamics. And I think, yes, overall, if you look at quantitatively, you will find that the regions which are most affected by conflicts and violent incidents are also experiencing climate change and degradation of resources. But at the same time, in Asia in particular, if you look at South Asia and Southeast Asia, there is much less emphasis again on what kind of dynamics or what kind of intersections lay between these two. And I think more studies have to be conducted to understand these dynamics and accordingly come up with solutions which are targeted at particular communities and regions for that matter. So I think that becomes important, and there is a dearth of knowledge or data as far as the conflicts and natural resources management and environmental change is concerned. Nature-based solutions are increasingly becoming important, and I think with so many cyclones, for instance, affecting the Sundarbans region, which is shared by India and Bangladesh, I think people have realized the importance of, for instance, the mangroves, which have been destroyed for infrastructure purposes and other kinds of construction purposes. And there is an increasing awareness about why we need to invest more in nature-based solutions, and that's something that is catching up as well. Last but not the least, I think funding flows and the kind of transparency that we require in these flows is important for, again, not just in terms of conflict sensitivity, but also in terms of security, and the kind of security architectures we have put in place, and the aid organizations that Jamie talked about as well, right, which are quite active in this region in tackling climate change related problems. So that transparency, the funding flows, and the kind of representation that is given to the communities is something that becomes extremely important for long-term security of this continent. Now, I would like to end with this quote from the great derangement, Amitabh Ghosh. In fact, he wrote this book on climate change and looking at South Asia, more particularly Bangladesh, India, and some of these countries. And this is what he writes: if whole societies and polities are to adapt, then the necessary decisions will need to be made collectively within political institutions, as happens in wartime or national emergencies. After all, isn't that what politics in its most fundamental form is about? Collective survival and the preservation of the body politic. So that's what he says, and I think that kind of carries the message of what we need for a long-term solution to the kind of problems that we are facing in terms of environmental security. Yes, I think I'll stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dhanasree. It was really excellent, and thank you so much for reminding us as well of this bottom-up approach that is so important. We are operating on such a high level that we sometimes forget the communities level, the wisdom that's existing already there, and this is what I actually try to promote in my activities, my courses. So thank you so much for bringing this back. Okay, we are now we have now around half an hour for Q&A, and we have received some very interesting questions. And what I would like to suggest that I will ask all of these questions now, and then we will go with the order in which we were presenting. I can see that we've lost Mukhtar, but I hope he will come back. So the first question is very, very interesting. It is about how, we are asking this question of new normal, but how can we master the international geopolitics and international relations, the realism and egoism? So I think, Dhanasree, you mentioned this a little bit, of our states, governments, for a better and real governance of the global affairs. So very fundamental question, really, not only pertaining to the conversation about the planet, but I think it's very important here. Another question, and quite general as well, is about the role of the United Nations Security Council. Should it tackle climate change? And we know that there have been some attempts to do it, of course, in the recent years. But how can we push it even more? The third question is about the US and the hope that everyone is really lying in the new administration. But the question is, so how can we trust that 4 years down the line, things won't change again? So how much can we trust or rely on major players like USA in acting on climate? And last but not least, a much more micro economy question with geopolitical implications, of course, about electric cars. So this is a great idea, obviously, but in terms of battery production, disposal, throwaway factor of the fossil fuels vehicles, how do we put this together? Like how do we actually implement it? Voila, these are the questions, and I think that we will start with Alexander.
Thank you, Ada. Quite a wide range of questions. Not sure if I can tackle all of them, but just a few of these. So basically a lot of these questions are like, okay, well, we've heard all of this, but how are we now going forward? And with big international questions, the first thing you normally talk about, starting at the highest level, would be the United Nations. Of course, the UN itself has been involved for a long time. I would say 1992 is a good starting point. You could actually go further back. But the UNFCCC so not Security Council, but UN as a body. UNFCCC is for years, of course, very active in trying to get all countries in the world on board to take climate change seriously. The UN contributes to knowledge via the landmark IPCC reports that come out all the time. And of course, the main theme there is work towards international agreement to tackle climate change as well as its consequences, where up till now the Paris Agreement is of course the landmark accord, and we hope that the next year, postponed now, next year in Glasgow, we really have another big step further. UN Security Council, I think the question was particularly about Security Council. It has been stepping up its efforts to work on it, but not all 5 permanent members of the Security Council are convinced that the link between climate change and security exists. They might accept that. They don't really, all of them, but certainly not all of them agree that even if that would be so, that is something for the Security Council to deal with. At least one of the P5 seems to have changed course or will change course on 20th of January and is preparing for it. But we still got a few other members. So what you see, there's a lot of activity in the UN Security Council now, often by the elected members, if I may call the other ones, so just to contrast the ones that have not been elected actually, but by the elected members of the Security Council to get the issue more on the map. And you see, for instance, that in resolutions of the Security Council more often is now referred to the link between climate change and security. And what you also see is, with especially the help of Sweden, that has really campaigned for that, that you have now about 3 officers, people working for the UN in different agencies of the UN to really look through the climate change lens at the problems and trying to get this more holistic approach. So it's a beginning. We're certainly not there yet. As it often goes, as soon as you move downward towards more regional organizations, the lower the level becomes that you look at. So it could be, let's say, something like the EU, or you could go down to a country, or you could even go down to a city. When it gets smaller, you can become much more effective. So at a very different level, if you start, for instance, at cities, you see that is often seen as a level where you can be so much more concrete and more effective to deal. So you have to work on all these levels. On the changes in the US, how can you be sure that the US can be trusted not to move back to what we've seen in the past 4 years? In 2024, we will have to see. I mean, we have seen that a significant part of the American voters have, after 4 years of Trump, voted again for President Trump, and the contrast between the two different views between the two main parties in the US has, I believe, never been as big, as at least not in the last century, has never been as big as between those two parties. The other party might win again next time, and what I believe is very hopeful is that never before in the history of the United States have more than 80 million people voted for the president that has been elected now, and that's a president that Joe Biden that focuses very much on reuniting the country and the kind of divisions that have been created in society, to work on those and to lower those divisions. And if that policy is working, then whomever wins the elections in 2024 may not be a party that is driven so far to the fringe, to whatever side of the politics that is. Yeah, last thing on the electric cars. That's of course a very, very hopeful development. I think in only a few years we will see a massive transition worldwide towards electric vehicles. It's so much more efficient. It's so much more better for the climate. This is one of the most hopeful developments. I mean, it's just a relatively small segment of the whole problem of the CO2 pollution that we are producing, but it's clearly a winner. It has passed the point of that is just something experimental, and it's also so much more efficient. I mean, if you just take a combustion engine, it's produced out of 1,000 different parts that are assembled together. The motor of an electric vehicle is just 14 parts. It's a major game changer, and of course it also depends on, from a climate perspective, where you get the energy from. But even if the energy that you use for your electric vehicle is produced by burning fossil fuels in a central plant, that is taking place at a more efficient way that you can do it in this little motor that you carry around in your car. So it is certainly having an impact. It is hopeful. It's a start of the kind of transformation that we need in society. Ultimately, I would prefer seeing much more investment in public transport, especially in trains, high-speed trains that can replace people flying short distances. About 70% of all flights are done in short distances of 2 or 3 hour flights. You can replace it by trains, as we do in huge parts of Europe nowadays. It's just more efficient. I mean, last thing on that thought, if you take a car, about maximum 10% of the weight of the car, if you're a very heavy person, but probably even less, is actually what needs to be transported. So if let's say, if you have a car of 800 kilos and there's a driver of 80 kilos, you're transporting 720 kilos that doesn't need to be transported. And if you compare that to a bicycle, it's the other way around. It's less than 10%. It's actually the weight of the bicycle that you're on. Just a few thoughts here. I'll leave it there, and let's move to the others. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And just before we move to Jamie, I will give the floor to Mukhtar because he actually needs to board the plane. So I'll just give him the floor just for a second. Mukhtar, if you could unmute yourself and come back on camera.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Actually, I thought our session was going to end, but I'm being called. Our flight is ready. If there are any questions for me, I think I'm very sorry I will not be able to answer. But if there are any questions, I think kindly, if Anna could send to me, then I will respond to them within the shortest time possible. But it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much. This has been very enriching, and God bless you all. Thank you very much, my colleagues.
Thank you very much. Safe trip.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Anna, thanks. Alexander inevitably, unsurprisingly, covered the points, many points I wanted to make. So in telegraph style, because I know time is limited, very quickly. First of all, in the US, in the COVID-19 crisis, the big issue has been that the federal government has left it to the states, not always giving the states the resources. But in America, this state structure can also be an advantage because on climate change, several state governments, including Republican-led governments, really do get it. For example, Trump may be a climate change skeptic, but the governor of Florida, seeing rising sea levels in Miami, seeing all of these Category 4, Category 5 hurricanes hitting Florida very regularly, clearly does sort of get it. And you see, for example, a push now in many American states, including Republican states, to introduce at state level, for example, for vehicle emissions in California, much higher standards than what the federal government has been able to achieve. So I mentioned earlier, California has adopted the General Directive on Data Protection, although the US hasn't done so yet. So the decentralized nature of American government is a source of hope. The second thing is business. Again, the business is often Republican because they like low taxes, but they get it. They know that the climate change transition is coming. They can see the way in which the data economy has become so much more important. In America, for many years in America, the oil companies were the biggest companies on the stock market. Now, of course, it's the tech companies. They know that the transition is underway, and the business community, including Republican business leaders, has lobbied the Trump administration hard to take this more seriously, and I think they're going to work with Biden as well. And for the average American, the reality that this year, polar vortexes in winter, extremely hot summers, prolonged droughts, the number of hurricanes, the bushfires, the perfect storm, is an undeniable reality. Climate change is no longer something that happens to poor people elsewhere in the world. It now happens to the rich countries as well. But my final point on the United States is that Biden has to come up with a double narrative. His own voters get it that it's all about a climate change adjustment. But the Trump supporters are interested in the economy. And the one thing that Biden has to do, but it can be done, is to make the narrative that, look, guys, for every job disappearing in the coal industry in Pennsylvania, there are 5 jobs being created in the green economy. This is the source of growth. This is going to bring, for you forgotten, left behind people, providing you can train for these kind of jobs, your incomes back, your prosperity back. And this is going to get the middle class back into a more comfortable position. So, you've got to change the narrative sometimes and put the narrative in terms of, what people respond to. And the economy is the way. So I'm not completely without hope that Biden can sort of achieve that. But it's going to be difficult for the reasons that Alexander gave. On multilateralism, it's true that the last couple of years, it hasn't been working too well at the level of the great powers and the interstate level. But look what's been going on. In dealing with COVID-19, universities have got online to talk to each other and to share data. Universities like Oxford have married up with companies like AstraZeneca to pursue research. If you know international politics, you know that it doesn't just happen at the state-to-state level any longer. We have a treaty in the UN to ban landmines because of an American campaigner and an NGO called Jody Williams. We now have a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons because of an NGO called ICANN and so on. We've got now, what some people call minilateralism. We've got groups of countries working together to set the standards, working with civil society. The EU, by the way, is very good at doing that. That's joined up approach. And I think that's one of its strengths. That's the way that international action takes place these days. It's no longer all top down. In democracies, there's considerable scope for the bottom up. And you look at things, for example, something that I worked on some years ago with the Council of Europe, which was the cyber crime treaty convention. It started with 20 countries in Europe. It's now got 70 countries across the world that have signed up to this. They recognize that that's the standard that makes sense for them. But of course, the tough thing is going to be getting some of the authoritarian states that don't have that grassroots civil society and want to do everything top down at the governmental level and have the obsession with sovereignty to get them on board. But, let's face it, Russia clearly sees that the writing for fossil fuels is on the wall, like Saudi Arabia. China is, the world's largest producer of cheap solar panels and understands the implications. And so, we can maybe construct some kind of dialogue, beyond trade frictions or disputes about regional conflicts, we can perhaps construct some kind of meaningful dialogue. The problem, though, with the big authoritarians like us is that we tend to be contradictory. You know, China has done an enormous amount to wake up to climate change and to push solar power and to green its economy, but it's still building today 150 coal-fired power stations in Africa. So what it's doing internationally is in contradiction with what it's doing internally, and we have to stop sort of solving the problem in one area while exporting it and making it worse elsewhere. Finally, UN Security Council, just very briefly, Alexander addressed this, but there are some things that the Security Council can work on. For example, responsibility to protect, that's a UN doctrine. And as we're going to have more and more climate migrants and displaced people, does a climate migrant have the same status in international law and protection and asylum as a refugee from war? Today, the answer to that is no, but we're going to have 5 times more climate refugees by the middle of the century than conflict refugees. So what the UN can do, as Alexander pointed out, through its sort of moral leadership, it's setting the standards, like the Sustainable Development Goals, is feed in this human factor so that the people who are suffering from the climate side have the same status as traditionally people who have been covered by the Convention on Refugees, and the responsibility to prepare, not only a responsibility to protect, but a responsibility on states to take this seriously and prepare, because it's like in any crisis, like pandemics, those countries who are prepared for it, think Taiwan, think South Korea, deal with the pandemic a lot better than those countries who are unprepared. Finally, electric cars, I think Alexander said a lot on that. The real problem is transport, because cars are for transport, which is still 90% dependent upon fossil fuels. We've made great progress, with smart grids in houses and insulation and all of that kind of thing, but the transport sector is the nut to crack. I just saw a final point here the other day that in a place in Australia, they ran the first electric train 3 kilometers down a track, a place called Byron Bay. It's a start. 3 kilometers is not yet the 300 kilometers, but if you can run it for 3 kilometers, then no doubt science very quickly will get those trains to run at 300 kilometers and get some of those cars off the road. Because of course, if we go to electric cars, we're going to need vast amounts of electricity to power those electric cars. And how we do that is going to be the challenge.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And now we move to Dhanasree.
So, I don't have much to add, but maybe whatever Jamie and Alexander have already covered, at least 2 of them. But I have a few points to make, at least on the geopolitics part, because that's something I raised during my presentation as well. So like I ended my presentation, I'm not necessarily bogged down by the lack of momentum, so-called lack of momentum in the top-down approaches, because like I said, there is a lot happening from the bottom-up approach, so like Jamie mentioned, there are a lot of initiatives that are happening. So even though like in the Himalayan region, there may not be much of interstate cooperation happening right now, like ICMOD is doing a lot of stuff. They are doing a lot of activities through which data sharing is happening, climate services are being delivered. There's a lot of local community-led, like cautionary action being taken as far as dealing with floods and drought and agrarian problems are concerned. There is digitalization, which is also helping the local farmers deal with some of these problems, which are all kind of financed sometimes by public-private players or by startups and all these different kind of actors who are now part of the game as well. So you don't have to entirely depend on the national government or the provincial governments for any sort of action to take place. That's good news, thankfully. So I'm very hopeful on that front. But yes, I also understand, like at a geopolitical level, like I would say geopolitics sometimes also creates space for at least showing yourself as a responsible power, which is a game that is at least being played between India and China right now a lot on issues related to climate change. So once China declared the net zero emissions strategy, 2060, yes, like Jamie mentioned, there's a lot of problems with their policies with respect to how they're going to invest in so many coal projects outside of their territory through the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So just after that, this week, in fact, Prime Minister Modi also of India, he also mentioned how India has, kind of achieved or will overachieve its targets under the Paris Agreement. And there is a problem with that argument as well, because India tends to under-promise and over-deliver. That's how normally it happens. So yes, so all these different games that are being played at the geopolitical level may in fact create that space for, if not cooperation between states, but at least from the bottom up, like I said, it may create the kind of environment for promoting more and more actions on the ground level. So I would be hopeful about it more than anything else. And on the UNSC, I think it's interesting because India is one of those countries that has always opposed or has been apprehensive of discussing climate change in the Security Council. And India is going to enter the Security Council in 2021. So that's going to be another problem that countries like Germany and others would have to kind of think of as to how to really steer the discussions with India also in the Security Council, because they have traditionally opposed it. And I don't see any change in that strategy in the near future. And that has a lot to do with geopolitics rather than anything to do with climate change per se, because it's also a matter of India trying to get a seat in the UN Security Council, with a veto. That becomes an important part of the debate. So sometimes these issues are muddled with geopolitical kind of narratives, but I feel, again, we don't have to depend on the UNSC to do some of these things. I think we need to go down some of these levels of governance and look at where it can work and where you can get the stakeholders to participate in a more meaningful manner. Don't go by the negativity which may be pervading the UN institutions as of now. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dhanasree. So we have 1 minute left for this session. I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time of your very busy schedules to contribute to this panel on what is the new normal for the planet. I wanted to thank all the participants for your participation, for your excellent questions, for your attention. And as you probably know, the GCSP 25th anniversary happens under the hashtag #OnlyTogether. And I just wanted to end with this, because I think that only together can we come together and actually influence our organizations, our governments, our families, our friends, in order to take action to create this positive scenario for the new planet. And I hope that we were able to give you some hope and some insights in order to do it, because we are very powerful and we shouldn't forget this. Thank you so much.